Okay, we're gonna switch to Screencast-O-Matic because Kaltura broke again, and I think we'll just finish the class through this. So there's an unfavorable correlation of resources and space that place a perpetual strain on the Far East region. People in industry are located in the west of the USSR, in Moscow and Leningrad and St. Petersburg, and the raw materials were in the east. And so there's this adage in the Soviet Union that the Far East was richly endowed by nature, but poorly developed by man. And this will basically hold true through most of the USSR. Uh, in Moscow, this area is commonly regarded as the white elephant because it used more investment than it yielded resources, which it should not have because it had plenty of resources. And worst of all, it was importing what it should have been exporting. It had 30% of Russia's timber reserves, yet it was importing paper because it had a paper shortage. It has fossil fuels galore, but it had an energy deficit for most of the Soviet Union period. And it massively failed to grow enough food proportioned by all of the 5-year plans, quotas that were set every 5 years for agricultural growth. So by the end of the 1960s, the region is importing two-thirds of its grain, half its meat, half its milk and vegetables, a third of its eggs, and a fifth of its potatoes. And so the problems are not just that it's permafrost, that a lot of the region is in permafrost, which we know because we live in Alaska what permafrost is, but it's also that machinery was old, it was misused, um, people didn't work hard, people misuse the machinery on purpose because they didn't want the state to get all of the food that they're growing, and so on and so forth. And because of this quote unquote misused machinery, for example, in 1971, a third of all of the region's soy crop, which was a very important commodity at the time and is today, a third of its soy crop was destroyed by quote unquote misused machinery. In the 1970s and 60s into the 70s, roughly half of the potatoes, cabbages, cucumbers, and fish that were grown or harvested in the region rotted while awaiting delivery. Right? That's a huge amount of waste. Half of all the basic agriculture and fish that are being harvested every year in this region does not make it to where it needs to go. And Moscow bore no small responsibility for this, as most of the resources that the USSR spent went to the west of the Urals. What they did spend in the Far East, they concentrated in extractive industries, right? Getting natural resources out of the ground, cutting it down, or out of the ocean. And that undercuts social infrastructure. And social infrastructure balances development. And so what we're talking about is this results in a neglect of housing, roads, hospitals, and schools. And the list goes on and on. And despite the push to get people to move there with wage bonuses, rapid promotion, and long vacations, by the 1970s, only 1 in 6 settled down for more than 3 years, and only 1 in 10 engineers and managers stayed for longer than 3 years, meaning they went over there looking to make more money, have a better life, and they didn't like it, so they moved back. Also, regional transport could not keep up with demand because the region was the most heavily guarded and distant periphery in the USSR, and it didn't have any highways across Siberia. So there's no way to move all of these people except through railroads and airplanes. And Aeroflot, the notorious Soviet airline, was inept. Was inept. It was lackadaisical, and its air traffic control system was terrible. And so demand always was higher to move from one place than seats available. And so almost every flight that you would take out of Khabarovsk or out of Vladivostok would be a fight for seats. It's kind of like Southwest Airlines without the A, B, C, D, E. It's just like, okay, the plane is open, go find a seat. And so there were fights all the time trying to get a seat in an airplane or a train. In 1983, a Vladivostok paper announced that passengers spent more time getting tickets than actually getting to their destinations. Right? That's not a efficient way to move people and goods. However, despite the shortages and isolation, it did have some compensations for living in the Far East. Most residents had their own garden where they grew their own flowers and cucumbers and tomatoes. You didn't have to go far to pick mushrooms and berries, and there were ample opportunities to hunt and fish. State stores did occasionally have carrots, lemons, and bananas, and when the salmon were running on Sakhalin and Kamchatka, red roe was practically given away by the bag. Although by the end of the 1970s into the 1980s, they're starting to realize that there aren't as many salmon as there used to be. You could get fresh fish and squid in Vladivostok and Khabarovsk. You could, when the time was right, also get some chicken and pork. You could even get boiled walrus in most cities during this time period. I don't know if you'd want to eat boiled walrus, but I'd actually like to try it at some time. And if you knew the right people on the black market, you could get red meat under the counter. Or if you went to the right collective farm with the right amount of schnapps and the right tasting schnapps, you could bring back a cow or a pig to the butcher. And really, shortages were just a way of life. And this is the way of life for most people in the USSR. Fresh fruits and veggies were a very rare commodity, especially in the winter. And dairy was scarce in the summer, not only because of spoilage, but because there's so many people in the Navy and Army in the eastern regions, milk goes to them first. If you lived outside a city, it would be hard to get your clothes dry cleaned, your shoes or your appliances repaired, your farm equipment, any type of technical work. If you didn't know what to do, it would be hard to get these things fixed. And there's the small things too, like you couldn't get your photos developed, which is important. And housing plagued the entire regions. In Vladivostok, for example, many thousands of people lived on anchored ships in the bay. And I'm not talking about living in their own houseboat. I'm talking about living in a ship, in like in the passenger sides of a ship, and that was your actual house. So you would leave that in the morning, go to work, and then go back. Right? That's not a good way to live. And you could wait for decades to get an apartment in some places. Not to mention the high cost of living and the scarcity of houses meant that kind of equaled out your high wages. So they got you to come out there with high wages, but then what ended up happening is a lot of those high wages are going to your housing and your cost of living. Public health did improve in places, but it deteriorated in others. Things like typhus and tuberculosis, which were really big problems in the early 20th century in this region, that's brought under control. But you still had a lot of tick-borne illnesses like Lyme disease and encephalitis that sometimes reached epic proportions in the summer, and there wasn't much done to combat that. Hospitals were built, but they lacked new technology and medicines. Dental service of a professional type could only be found in cities. If you lived in the country, you basically went to your country dentist. And I don't even want to guess what happened in some of those places. It's probably like the old Wild West movies where the dentist is the barber, is the banker, and he basically pulls out teeth. That's what dentistry was. Pharmacies were around, but they often lacked medicine and drugs. So many people relied on local berries and herbs for healing. And many municipalities built sewers and indoor plumbing, but they also lacked drinking water. So you had running water, but you didn't have water that you could drink. The Amur River, for example, a river where people 30 years ago would drink out of in the summertime, would be filled with sludge because Khabarovsk sewage system ran raw sewage into the river. Vladivostok poured raw sewage into Peter the Great Bay. Right? There's no refineries, there's no water treatment centers. You're just pushing raw sewage into large places of water. Quote unquote minerals in the Khabarovsk water supply required normal citizens to unclog their pipes about once a year. People from that city, Riley, boasted that they led the country in kidney stones per capita. But then they also boasted that most of them passed them because you really thought twice before having surgery in any of their hospitals. So there you go. But in the end, there is no question that by the 1960s and the 1970s, people lived better than their grandparents and their parents. However, these gains are overshadowed by rising expectations, and also there's this political passivity during the era of stagnation that sweeps the USSR. And we talked about it last slide, where Marxism and Leninism and Stalinism, for the most part, are going by the wayside, and ideology is kind of losing its power. However, the late 1960s and 1970s are also the time period when pensioners and people who grew up during the Stalinist era would sit around courtyards in the summer, or their really small, tight living rooms in the wintertime, and they'd wistfully recall how under Stalin people lived more cozily than they did in the 1960s and 70s, and how you could walk down to the store and buy canned crab and it didn't cost you a week's ration. So already by the late 1960s and early 1970s, you start to get this kind of nostalgia for the Stalin era, which is completely surprising in the East, considering the gulags had just closed down 10 years before, right? Short-term memory. Now, let's talk about this last slide. We'll kind of talk about the intellect, diversity, and then we'll discuss a little bit of crime, and we'll end with the environment. And we'll move more into the environment post-Soviet Union period as well. So there's this new generation of people, and this is Khabarovsk. You can see Khabarovsky at the top there. This is one of the trains. Looks very Western. So there's this new generation in the 60s and 70s who learn how to compartmentalize the intellect and act out political charades. This is when people would indulge privately in black humor about their leaders, especially their local leaders that they knew kind of public and private affairs about. So they talk privately about their leaders, but you would not do that publicly. You wouldn't question anyone. So there's no shortage of scientists, engineers, teachers, factory workers who would applaud, say, like the invasion of Afghanistan in the mid-1970s, or denounce Ronald Reagan, or denounce Alexander Solzhenitsyn for writing One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, or writing the Gulag Archipelago. And so most people would read things like that, but when asked if they'd read it, and Solzhenitsyn actually wins a Nobel Prize in literature for that, within official earshot, you would say, no, I have not read it, or you would say, I think Solzhenitsyn is a traitor. As one young man said in 1974, a kid raised in Kolyma, so he was around the gulags growing up, or he at least saw the remnants of them and knew people who were there. When he was asked about Solzhenitsyn writing about gulags, he says, Solzhenitsyn is always defaming his country and people in his writings, so permit me not to consider him a true Russian writer. Now, does he honestly believe that? No one knows because it's the Soviet Union and you say what you think people want to hear. But that's the idea. You also had, interestingly enough, in this Far East, you did have diversity, but you also had delinquency, which is a word that the Soviets like to use for people who commit crimes. And although by the end of the 1970s, ethnic Russians formed over 85% of the population of the Far East region, it was diverse and it was divided. For instance, there were 82 nationalities counted along the Baikal-Amur main railroad line alone. And there were 2 million Ukrainians along the Pre-Amur in that region northeast of the Amur River. There were settlements with names like Astrakhanka, which would show that these are people who came from Central Asia. There was a town called Kishinevka, which is Finnish, people from Finland. There was a town called Abo, which would be people from Estonia. And there was a little region called Latvia, which obviously is people from Latvia. So there was diversity, and so with the diversity, there's different attitudes about authority. You had military officers and security personnel like the KGB and the MVD who were pillars of conservatism. You had merchant seamen who were able to go around the world and at least around the USSR, so they were a little more liberal and anti-Soviet. You had construction workers and fishermen who were also kind of had this more free spirit, because construction workers and fishermen are also people who could travel throughout the USSR. And you also had a lot of religious sects, Christian, Muslim, even a little bit of Hindu from Asia in these areas as well. And so they're kind of not kind of, they are technically breaking the law by holding religious services and doing things like that, but they're so far away from the center that it's not questioned and it's not forced. It's hard to put. It's not quite as illegal when you're 9 time zones away to be a Christian or a Catholic or a Muslim as it is if you're nearer to Moscow or Leningrad. Camp survivors obviously formed a very gritty anti-Chekist, anti-Soviet element, especially in the underground. And they naturally gravitated towards the larger cities like Vladivostok because they were still banned from Moscow to live in Moscow or Leningrad. Right, so you have a whole bunch of camp survivors. So we know that a lot of camp survivors went west as soon as possible. But we also know, that a lot of camp survivors stayed in the east because they didn't have anywhere else to go, and they naturally gravitate towards the cities, and obviously they're going to be anti-Soviet and anti-government. And one of the things that adds to this quote-unquote delinquency and crime was booze. Far Easterners showed a very good resourcefulness in supporting their drinking habits. They could basically make booze out of anything. And I don't know if this is true or not, but there is a story about a Haberov's kindergarten teacher who, at the end of school one day, was walking out into the forest near the school, and she saw a bunch of kindergartners making alcohol out in the forest. You don't know if that's true or not, but the fact that there's even a story like that means that people were starting young, right? Probably shouldn't laugh about that, but it's kind of funny. And there are all kinds of great local stories about this. For instance, in Vladivostok once there was a guy who was a bulldozer driver, and he was pretty tipsy, and he accidentally ran into a woman's fence. So she came out and yelled at him. And so what he does after she yells at him is he goes and bulldozes right through her house, right? Things like that. Um, and so these stories are pretty pretty common. And so the authorities try to combat alcoholism by price hikes, fines, sobering up cages, we call it detox, forced therapy, and so on. But just like anything in this kind of very authoritarian type of atmosphere where basically you need quotas and numbers, most people would just meet their quota and their numbers by recycling through the same drunks, right? And they'd say, look at the improvement. Look at how many people we have who are coming in. And it's just the same people coming in over and over again. Um, Women, though, during this time period made some economic gains, and importantly, the divorce rates in the Far East climbed higher from the already highest levels above the national average. So, for instance, Magadan had the highest divorce rate in the USSR. And so, what this suggests is two things. One, that there's a lower tolerance for alcoholism, and two, that there's a lower tolerance for domestic violence. Um, and they argue that this is because women of the East were much more individualistic and independent than women from the West, because young women of this era came to the Far East for wage bonuses, for paid holidays, and for access to supposedly better food than they can get in Western Europe, or excuse me, Western Russia. And so what these women did is they provided a lot of the working force for, let's say, the fishing industry. More than 15,000 went to sea each year on floating canneries, and they'd stay out there for months on end, right? Not easy work. They would also captain freighters, and they staffed scientific labs on research vessels. Um, and, and and the main idea that women were becoming more prosperous and independent is the fact that in almost all of these cities, daycare centers grew exponentially, meaning that women were having children and then they were dropping them off at daycare and then going to work. And so there's a sociological idea in Russia at this time and into today, and I probably across the world, is just the sense that women who who went to work were more independent in a lot of areas. And obviously, because you have a lot of men in an area who work hard and at some time probably have a little cash in their pocket, prostitution flourishes. Um, and a lot of this has to do is because these merchant seamen were paid partly in hard currency, which means that that's your favorite clientele if you're a prostitute. It's a cash exchange without question. Um, So each return of a fishing fleet, right, they'd send out these really large fishing fleets, state fishing fleets, with hundreds of ships and boats. When they'd come in to a city, this would trigger a migration from all of the metropolitan centers in Russia. I mean, we're talking even as far as St. Petersburg. Prostitutes would come to the east, and then they'd get designated areas where they'd be tacitly tolerated by officials, and then the officials would get their cut as well. In Nahodka, for instance, you saw an average of about 30,000 foreign mariners annually as well. And so this is big business because foreigners definitely had cash on them. And what's interesting about this is the KGB used prostitutes in a lot of instances to spy on foreigners and to spy on their own people. It's kind of the whole idea. If you watch any of those spy movies or read the spy novels, is how they use women to get men to give up secrets. This was actually happening in the Far East. They were using prostitutes to get close to men and get, hear rumors and just get the idea to make sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. And really what this shows is that crime was higher than you would think, especially in rural areas, because society functioned through connections more than by laws. So the distinction between enterprise and crime really tended to blur, and this will happen in the post-Soviet Russia as well, right? There's a big blurring between what's wrong and what's right. So for instance, in the Far East, poaching was very much a fact of daily life. And it was practiced under the umbrella of hunting and fishing clubs. But what poaching does is it enriched the diets of the family and friends of the people who did this, and it also supplemented the incomes of very underpaid fish, what we would consider to be fish and game employees, right? You turn a blind eye to me poaching this Siberian tiger, which are either extinct or almost extinct, and Siberian tigers are the largest cats in the world. And I'll give you a cut of what I make. Right. So this is still going on all over the world today as far as exotic animals are concerned. And a lot of these schemes to make money, not just with poaching, but with crime in general, it took more than a couple people to do this. For example, there was a scheme to divert shipments of Kamchatka red caviar that was supposed to go to Moscow, and the scheme was to get it into local channels so they could sell and use throughout the East. Basically, the idea is it's our caviar. We want to make money off of it. And so, but in order to do this, you had to have cooperation from a whole bunch of people, right? You had to have cooperation from employees in the railroad, the fishing cooperatives, the research institutions who were counting the fish and saying how much roe was created, the employees from there, all of the black marketeers who are selling it throughout the local areas, all of the local officials who know this is happening but are taking their cut and telling Moscow why they're not getting their caviar, and so on and so forth. So it really was a conspiracy. So a lot of this crime is very intricate and well thought out. Bookstore clerks sold all kinds of illegal literature that was very high in demand. However, greed could get out of hand. For instance, a commander in the Pacific Fleet and his wife were found bludgeoned to death in their Vladivostok apartment over what appeared to be a miscalculation of how much black market goods the commander was willing to sell to a local gang. He obviously was not willing to sell to the, I don't know what a Vladivostok gangster would be called. And so he got killed for it. So, crime pays, but it also kills. And there are all kinds of examples of this, especially in Russian newspapers, the crime blotters. Murder was not something that was, it was a daily occurrence out here, and a lot of it had to do with crime. And so to deal with this quote-unquote deviant behavior, the MVD, or the Ministry of Internal Affairs, established higher schools, quote-unquote higher schools, throughout the cities, and this was basically what we would call juvie hall, for juvenile detention centers. And you had party organizations that held endless meetings in schools, factories, and collective farms to try to strengthen discipline and ideology. But we know by the early 1980s, even in the 1970s, ideology is going by the wayside. It's obvious that Marxism is not working to these people on a daily basis. They'd also send people from the West to come to the east and make sure that people showed up to work on time. They would spot check you with ID papers on your collective farm or in your whatever job you were working for, and so that people could actually tell that their government was spying on them, and it was made public. And so what this does, it achieves nothing but beyond creating more paperwork, promoting people's careers, and showing the average person that your government was spying on you, right? And that just didn't sit well with people in the East. It was a way of life, but it was kind of a tacit understanding that, yeah, we know the KGB and the MVD are spying on us, but also kind of stay out of our everyday life. We don't mind that. But when you start checking our papers and making sure we're to work on time and that we're only taking 15 minutes for lunch, so on and so forth, that's when people start getting upset. And so the bottom line is all of these things that the Soviets are trying to do as far as dealing with alcoholism, dealing with people not showing up for work, dealing with crime, dealing with stealing from the state coffers, address symptoms, but not the cause. And the cause was social malaise. Like we said, you're 9 time zones from Moscow, and they're telling you all of these things. They're setting all these 5-year plans for you. You don't see any of these people. You don't know. You don't care about that. And so there's just kind of, I'm going to grow cucumbers and I'm going to eat them because I'm growing them, right? And real quickly, we'll end here with the environment. And we'll talk more about this in the post-Soviet era, but it was not just the social environment that is changing, but also the natural is deteriorating during this time as well. I mean, we're talking earths and forests, rivers, lakes, coastal waters, fauna, flora are being subjected to absolute human hands and despoilization. Scientists were recognizing the danger sign, but bureaucrats were slow or didn't care. And many in the hierarchy believed that environmental maladies were a product of capitalism, and they couldn't be a product of communism, right? It's the bad capitalists taking all the fish out of the ocean, not us. So, for example, in 1972, the vice president of the USSR Academy of Sciences, which sounds like he should be a scientist, but actually all he is a bureaucrat, he articulated in a speech, quote, ecological problems will not develop in the USSR because under socialism there is unity of political and economic leadership. Right? What does that mean? That he's saying basically, because our leadership were so in tune politically and economically, we just can't hurt the environment. That's just ridiculous, right? But the Far East was on the forefront of change, kind of like Alaska is today. Um, and so even though from the center you're getting all of this stuff like we're not hurting the environment that's the capitalists who are doing this, public awareness of the vulnerability of the Far East biosphere to human intervention was very small, except for the people who lived there. So by the 1970s, fishermen had begun to notice that the salmon, once so plentiful that local peasants would use roe as plaster, were starting to disappear. And so and then in the 1980s, you get talk about bulldozers knocking down whole forests and strip mining, just making the environment bad. Poaching, even though poaching is a way to make money, they start talking about how they don't see as many Siberian tigers anymore, things of that nature. And destroying ancient forests are starting to be brought to the foreground, especially with the actual local people, the local population in the Far East. So, and as we will see, As awareness grew under the what we call glasnost and perestroika, which will be what we will talk about next week with the ending of the Soviet Union, anger will grow in the Far East as well as with the environment. So that is your PowerPoint for the week. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. Once again, I apologize. I just won't use Kaltura anymore. It's just taking too much of our time and it's not working correctly. So with that, here's your PowerPoint and let me know if you have any questions.